Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Fresh from the battleground of the peers versus the people, if the government overturns the overreaching House of Lords on the illegal migration bill, I will be asking, will the upper chamber go back to its constitutional role? The NATO signatories are meeting in Lithuania for their annual summit, but is it being obscured by the thick and controversial smoke of cluster bombs? Whilst the Americans are sensibly supporting the Ukrainian counteroffensive, we are restricted by a quixotic international treaty from which we should withdraw. And speaking of war, who knew that quoting the Bible could constitute a war crime, or indeed a crime against humanity? We will be joined by a Finnish Member of Parliament who has been put on trial for spreading the word of the Lord. Inverted blasphemy laws seem to be alive and kicking in the 21st century Europe. And this evening's denouement, the much-lauded commercial success that is Sit Down with Sitwell. Well, the unnamed BBC presenter facing allegations of misconduct is now facing more claims from a second young person. How will the BBC handle this as the pressure builds? State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by a trenchant panel this evening, the barrister and former Tory MP Jerry Hayes and the author and broadcaster Michael Crick. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Jacob. BBC presenter Jeremy Vine has put pressure on his unnamed colleague at the centre of two sets of allegations, suggesting it may be time for him to go public. It comes as a second person has come forward to make a complaint against the BBC presenter, accused of paying for sexually explicit photos. The broadcaster says it spoke to a person in their early 20s who claims they were sent a number of threatening messages by the host after they were allegedly contacted by the presenter on a dating app. The person says they were put under pressure to meet the BBC star, but never did. Speaking to the BBC, the second young person, who's not involved in the previous payments for photos allegation, says they remain scared by the power the presenter holds. Well, separately, the BBC has published details of its highest paid stars as part of its annual report. Gary Lineker remains the corporation's top paid presenter, taking home more than £1.35 million. Zoe Ball is the highest paid female presenter, earning more than £980,000. The NATO chief has announced allies have agreed to 3 steps to bring Ukraine closer to membership. Jens Stoltenberg says 11 nations will start training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 jets. They have also removed the requirement for a membership action plan, making Ukraine's path to becoming a NATO country easier. Well, in addition to this, they will create a Ukraine-NATO Council for consultation and decision-making, with the first meeting set to be held tomorrow. Joe Biden's former Chief of Staff, Susan Platt, told GB News the NATO membership will not happen until the conflict is over.
The U.S. has done everything they can in support of the war in Ukraine against Putin's army, and will continue to do that. I think there's time for everything, and I think it's great that we now have really a pretty much of a brick wall by including Finland and Sweden. Thank you to Mr. Erdogan joining in the NATO alliance against Russia.
A Romanian people smuggler has been jailed for 12 years and 7 months for the manslaughter of 39 Vietnamese migrants in 2019. 50-year-old Marius Draghici fled the country after the bodies of migrants were discovered in a container. They were being transported from Belgium to Essex by ferry. The High Court judge described Draghici as the organisers' right-hand man. Mortgage rates have hit their highest level in 15 years, surpassing figures seen in the aftermath of last year's mini-budget. The average rate on a 2-year fixed deal is now 6.66%, the highest level since 2008. The Bank of England raised its benchmark rate to 5% last month in an effort to bring down inflation. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now, though, it's back to Jacob.
It was in 1909 when an Asquith-led Liberal government, with Lloyd George as Chancellor, attempted to pass what was called the People's Budget, new taxes that targeted wealthy landowners to fund welfare reforms. It was the first budget that explicitly intended to redistribute wealth. The lower rate of tax was to increase to 3.75% and the higher rate to 5%. What glory days! The House of Lords, being full of wealthy landowners, naturally objected to it and took an entire year and 2 general elections for the Commons to overrule the Lords, with the consequence being the Parliament Act of 1911. Now, whilst the Lords may have been on the right side of history in the matter of not raising taxes, it was on the wrong side of peers against the people, and it's not on the right side of history today. And it should remember what happened in 1911. Today, the Commons voted on the 20 amendments made to the government's illegal migration bill. And other than some minor concessions to Conservative backbenchers, the Commons has bounced back the Lords' amendments with big majorities. Fundamentally, the function of the House of Lords is one of detail and process. When legislation passes through to the upper chamber, its primary role is to ensure that the legislation is properly written. That is to say, that it's a statutory instrument that has an affirmative rather than a negative process. The details of legislation, not the policy. The policy is for the Democratic House. But the Lords' amendments to the illegal migration bill are of a substantial political nature, rather than ones of constitutional propriety. And by acting in this way, it's pushing the boundaries of conventions. And bear in mind, we don't have a codified constitution. We have one based on conventions. And this is part of a broad trend from the upper house. We've discussed it on the programme before. The Lords seem to have a problem with the Conservatives, especially since Brexit. Since 2016, the government has lost more than half of its votes in the House of Lords, 350 defeats in 6 years. In the preceding 6 years, the number was 160, so it's more than doubled. And a lot of that was around Brexit and now on migration, an issue where the elected chamber has considerable public support and wherefore the Lords should be especially careful. The Salisbury Convention, strictly the Salisbury-Addison Convention, indicates that the House of Lords should not oppose manifesto policies. Well, the Conservative Manifesto of 2019 states that we intend to take control of immigration, and this obstruction by the Lords is in opposition to a clear democratic mandate. And it's also something that is urgent because people are arriving illegally by boat every day, and it's costing you, the taxpayer, millions and into the billions of pounds. £500,000 a day just to reserve spaces in hotels. £3 billion a year annual cost. More than 13,000 people have crossed the Channel already this year. But ultimately, the people always win in battles with the peers, and the Lords must remember that the Parliament Act of 1911 explicitly states its intention to substitute for the House of Lords, as it presently exists, a second chamber constituted on a popular instead of an hereditary basis. The sword of Damocles has dangled over the unelected upper chamber for 112 years, but how long will the horsehair hold? As always, I want to know what you think. Mailmog at gbnews.com. And now, I think, are we going to Surbiton to hear from Ray Addison on what's been going on there, an immigration problem, apparently, allegedly, but Ray, perhaps you can fill us in on all the details.
Good evening, Jacob. Yes, tensions were running high here earlier at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Surbiton. There was around about 150 protesters gathering to protest at the housing of Afghan migrants here in the hotel. It's understood there's around about 120 have been housed here for around the last 3 years. Now, there was also a much smaller pro-migration protest. You can hear and see them behind me now. Gathered. They've remained whilst the original protesters have actually left. Now, we did receive a statement from the Home Office. They said, we take the welfare and safety of those in our care incredibly seriously. I'd like to apologise for the language that you're hearing from some of the Antifa crowd here. Obviously, we have no control over that kind of language. I'll continue with the statement. The UK has made an ambitious and generous commitment to help at-risk people in Afghanistan, and so far we have brought around 24,600 people to safety, including thousands of people eligible for our Afghan resettlement schemes. I think best if I hand back to you now, Jacob.
For that, I hope people could hear some of it. I've always thought of Surbiton as being the place where the good life took place, so it's rather surprising to have riotous behaviour taking place where such respectability used to reside. But to go to the peers versus the people, Michael...
It's a bit snobbish, that remark, isn't it?
Well, is it?
Yes. So, where respectability
Well, but then
reside.
you've got all these people
Respectability resides everywhere.
swearing in the background.
Swearing?
Swearing in the background on live television.
Wickedness.
I think it's perfectly legitimate.
Would you
to
support
criticise
that protest?
I believe in the right of freedom of speech and free protest. They weren't blocking the roads, they weren't causing inconvenience to anybody. I'm not against people protesting. But that's not what we're here to discuss. We're here to discuss peers versus the people. Double the number of defeats in the last 6 years, the figures at the end of 2022, for the government than there were in the previous 6 years. The Lords seems to have become hyper-political.
I think there's some truth in that. I think they would argue that they're sorting out the messy, immoral bits of your legislation. Presumably, given what you said earlier, you will now tell Conservative peers in the House of Lords that if Labour come to power, they must not overturn any policies of the next Labour government.
Well, I think the conventions are fundamentally important.
So you would say that. So we got the headline.
Well,
Rees-Mogg says to Starmer government, you're OK, Lords shouldn't.
It depends.
Yes.
There are very clear areas where the Lords has a right to ask the government to think again. These are fundamental constitutional ones. So when Tony Blair wanted to go to 90 days imprisonment without trial, fundamental change in our constitution, the Lords was absolutely right to say think again. When it's a matter of day-to-day routine politics, it's much more questionable, so that's what the Lords is there for. And actually, I think Conservative leaders in the Lords, when we've been in opposition, have tended to get this balance right. Bear in mind that Lord Salisbury was willing to go along with a reform to the upper house because he thought that was a manifesto commitment and a reasonable thing for Labour to do.
But, of course, what the Commons have done today... Sorry, Jerry.
No, I'm just warming up.
For instance, there was I only heard it on the radio, but an excellent speech by Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, opposing part of this bill because it will deport people who have been trafficked to this country for prostitution, and they will then be deported back possibly to places where they will suffer
that's
considerable
not
harms.
true. The Minister gave a very good answer to her and said that the rise in people claiming human trafficking when they are threatened with deportation, it's gone from something like 7% to 73%, because it's the get-out-of-jail-free card, and that all that's being proposed is to make sure that there is some proper check on that claim. But, Jerry?
The House of Lords, believe it or not, is the conscience that the House of Commons should have. And the reason they have the conscience is there is no effective whipping system. They are there for life. They don't want to be leader of the House or business secretary. They don't want to slide up the greasy pole. What they want to do is try and get things right.
But that's not right. That if
it is right.
If you look at voting in the House of Lords, they almost all vote a party ticket. Rebellion in the House of Lords is not as rare as in the House of Commons, but it is quite rare.
OK, but why is that? The reason is you've got lots of parliamentary retreads. The old hereditary...
OK, but you're now completely changing your point. A moment ago you said it's conscious of the nation. Now you're saying it's got parliamentary retreads.
No, it's got parliamentary retreads, but because they're there for life, they are the conscience of the nation. They don't care about the whips. They can say what they believe.
Not all of them are conscience of the nation. A lot of them bought their peerages in murky deals with all the parties for money.
The treasurers...
in organised bribery by all the parties. But this shows the need, doesn't it, Jacob, to abolish the House of Lords?
No.
I think the second chamber is very important.
Well,
we don't want an elected second chamber.
But we don't want
to just elected in a different way.
No, it shouldn't be elected
as soon as you elect it, then it becomes as powerful as the House of Commons, and then we risk moving to US-style gridlock.
Yeah, but we don't
particularly
want that.
if you elect it on a different cycle.
Yeah.
Well, there's... Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go on. So I'm just saying the Salisbury rules. OK, we understand all of that, and your viewers will understand that when it comes down to it, push comes to shove, we go backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. At the end of the day, the elected chamber, particularly if there's a manifesto commitment, will win, and rightly so. But they have a right to get things that you guys, sort out, which you've you've got wrong. Even if it's policy, there's nothing wrong with the House of Lords getting up and saying, this is wrong.
It's just the scale of it that has grown so
Jacob,
much.
There's nothing new.
Well, there's politics. It's become a much less effective chamber recently.
No. And it's nothing to do with Brexit.
And in the end, you win. The Commons nearly always wins this process of ping-pong, as it's called, between the two chambers.
They always do.
Yes.
Well, the problem is not that the Commons may not win on an individual vote, but there isn't parliamentary time to get very important pieces of legislation through.
Well, and you'll have to wait a year.
Look, this will be fast-track through. You know, you relieve the House. You know how it works.
This bill will eventually get through.
Yes, and of course it's not going to make a ha'porth of difference.
The time it's taken to get this through,
because we believe in democracy.
Well, no, the government's legislative
debate.
programme, which had a manifesto behind it, is massively slowed down. That's the real problem.
There's very little going on in the Commons anyway at the moment, isn't there? So
all the bills are stuck in the Lords.
That's why you're able to come
What
here
were you
every
talking
evening.
about this afternoon? Not you personally, but what was on the floor of the House today?
The immigration bill. We were bouncing back all these motions from the House of Lords, sending them back.
Yeah, some people just do as they're told. They don't think it's true.
Well, no, actually, I do tend to think.
Well, you think it's
true,
but a lot of people
the government
don't.
very strongly on this. I think it's dealing with something important that my voters are concerned about, that across the country concerned about, and that illegal migration makes it harder for legal migrants to get here.
Well, of course, but do you honestly, in your heart of hearts, believe that when this bill goes through, it's going to make a ha'porth of difference?
Well, that is the key question. Does legislation make things different? Ultimately, it must do. Otherwise,
I tell you, one thing that would make a difference is if we tackle global warming properly, which you don't seem to have any interest in doing, because they're going to be coming in vast numbers.
Well, we can discuss the energy bill another week. It's a terrible piece of legislation, but we'll get on that another day. Thank you to my panel. Don't forget to let me know what you think. Mail.Mogg at GBNews. Coming up. Should the UK follow the practice of the United States and back the bid for cluster bombs to be sent to Ukraine? Plus, does free speech extend to the right to quote the Bible? Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. And you've kindly been getting in touch with your thoughts. Mike, the Lords must only be allowed to sit in the chamber for 5 years. We need rotation to let Britain move on in the direction wanted by the population. And Jill, Parliament has voted against most of the House of Lords amendments. This is a very long game of ping-pong that the British people will not stand for. Ahead of this week's NATO summit, the Biden administration confirmed that it will be providing Ukraine with the widely controversial munition, the cluster bomb. The US is one of a number of NATO members that has not signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions and is now supplying Ukraine with the weapons that Russia has used against Ukraine. The Convention on Cluster Munitions was signed by the Labour government on behalf of Britain in 2008 and bans their use, development and sale after concerns were raised over the damage it can do, the risk to civilians. Now, the Prime Minister stands by the convention. The question is, should we, like the United States, actually help Ukraine more actively with the weapons that they are asking for in the fight against Russia? The NATO summit, which started today, will see leaders discuss the Russian war in Ukraine, as well as Ukraine and Sweden's prospective membership talks. Ukraine's Prime Minister, Volodymyr Zelensky, has today criticised NATO members for their lack of readiness to accept Ukraine as one of its members. With the US supplying Ukraine with the ammunition and the support they need to keep fighting Russia, should Britain pull out of the convention and recognise that when you're at war, you will use the weapons that you need to win? Still with me is my panel, alleged barrister and former Tory MP, Jerry Hayes, and the author and broadcaster, Michael
I feel
Smith.
a writ coming.
Jerry, I'll give you first bite at this particular topic. Cluster bombs are horrible.
Yes.
They kill people.
Yes.
So do ordinary bombs.
Whoa. But they kill innocent civilians. That's the problem. That's why we signed... No. That's why we signed the convention with 100 other countries as well. However, the United States is not breaking international law. They
didn't sign the convention.
Exactly. They haven't signed the convention. In Ukraine, it's rather different because it's their territory. It's not as if they're using it against Russia. They're using it on their own territory, so they're responsible for clearing it up.
But isn't the reality that if we were at a war that required us to face invasion and being taken over, we would use any weapons that we could to win? That is just the nature of war when there's an existential threat to your nation.
No, because we've signed all sorts of conventions, chemical warfare.
But we'd use nuclear weapons.
Biological warfare. And there are good reasons for that, because innocent civilians could, because, you know, the wind...
But nuclear weapons.
Yeah, but you might as well just say, oh, who cares? War is war is war. We'll do what it is to win. We know in reality...
But in reality...
That's what happens.
That's what happens.
But, however, we're above that.
Michael,
we're a civilised race.
But shouldn't people be realistic that war is nasty and that if your country is about to be dismembered by an invader, you will use whatever weapons you can against them?
Well, I think if the Russians had invaded us and it hadn't got to nuclear war, we might... Well, we haven't got any cluster weapons, have we? So we couldn't use them unless somebody supplied... My overriding thing is, look, we've signed this international agreement. An agreement is an agreement. If we renege on an agreement, then there's nothing to stop other people reneging on all sorts of other agreements.
We can obviously pull out of agreements.
All right, pull out of an agreement, but it looks bad. Other people then pull out of agreements, not just on this, climate change, all sorts of things. And I think actually for the world to work, you need to have lots of agreements, because you haven't got a world government.
I just wonder whether America is wiser, that it doesn't sign up to these agreements because it recognises when push comes to shove, you won't actually stick to them, that the world is not the world that people who sign this agreement think it is. It's slightly woolly thinking that allows people to sign up, not to do nasty things, actually when your country's facing destruction.
But they haven't signed up to war crimes, have they? They won't accept the Hague.
I don't think America is wiser on this. I think, and America's not likely to suffer cluster bombs on the mainland of America. I think that they are very horrid. I've seen the effect of cluster weapons in the Middle East many years ago, long before this agreement, and they are very horrid indeed. And I think it was an advance for civilization to have this agreement. Not everybody signed it, unfortunately, but we did. And we are, as Jerry says, we in the West have to show the Russians we're better than you. We don't do these nasty things. And we don't do all the terrible things they've been doing to Ukrainian soldiers and all the castrating people and murdering them and raping them and whatever. And there are, I know it sounds odd, there are certain rules of war, and you should stick to them.
There are, and conventions, and certainly the treatment of prisoners is one that it seems to me to be very important to uphold, because that doesn't make the difference between winning and losing the war.
Well, it would. If you said, we're going to kill every prisoner we get, that would rather deter people from
but it might make them
fighting,
and we're going to shoot. We're going to shoot women and children.
But that sometimes makes people fight harder. And actually, some countries use that as a threat to their own populations.
It's a dangerous, slippery slope.
So if you look at Japan at the end of the war, they told their population that they would be killed if they didn't fight anyway.
Yeah.
So that's used as home propaganda sometimes to get the local population to carry on fighting.
We are civilised. That's what makes us British. We believe in the world order.
Well,
Don't you?
British, it makes us European, I like to think, but...
Well, I'm very suspicious of the world order as you might like to have it, which I think is
how do you think I would like to have it?
Telling democracies what to do. But the other interesting thing at the summit today is the membership of Ukraine. Sweden's membership is very straightforward. Very importantly, Turkey has agreed to it.
What was the deal there? There must have been a deal. There must have been a deal.
I don't know. There's probably some money involved.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting, the issue of Ukraine. It seems to me it's very hard to allow Ukraine to join NATO when it is actively at war.
because
you can't do it now.
NATO, is largely a deterrent rather than a fighting force. Has been so far. And if somebody joins in the middle of a war, then the obligation is on all of us to go and join in.
It's World War III.
No,
that's not going to.
Whereas if they'd been in NATO 2 years ago, then probably the invasion wouldn't have happened.
Sweden right to come in, the various other states who want to come in, yes, we've got to do that as a protection.
Finland coming in.
Yeah, Finland as well.
And it's very interesting, one of the effects of what Putin has done is to strengthen NATO and turn it into a much more effective alliance than it was before this invasion, and people actively wanting to join.
And interesting with Turkey, Erdogan, I think, is basically a bad man. However, we need that bad man because it shows stability. Now, I would have loved Erdogan as a Democrat to actually lost the election. However, it wouldn't have been good for us because he's got contacts with most of the Middle Eastern countries, and particularly with Russia. We need him on side, and he's a member of NATO.
Yeah, that's very important. But that's very interesting because you're now moving from your woolly world order to realpolitik
woolly world
in
order.
one fell swoop.
A rules-based order, not woolly.
A woolly world order. I'm for realpolitik. But thank you to my panel, who I hope to see next week. Coming up, is it a war crime to quote the Bible? Plus, the BBC crisis persists with fresh allegations. Where does it go from here?
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GBNews.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. Further heavy showers over the next few days, quite breezy as well, temperatures around average for the time of year. So we look at the bigger picture. Low pressure is in charge of our weather at the moment, bringing in those showers. Pushes just a little further east over the next few days, introducing a northwesterly flow. So quite chilly around some northwestern coasts of the UK. To end Tuesday, showers fade for a time across parts of England and Wales, but continue across Northern Ireland and Scotland. Through the night, some of these heavy at times, then pushing back into Northern England and North Wales by the end of the night. Temperatures for all in double figures, 14 or 15 Celsius as minimums in towns and cities, a little lower in the countryside. The best of the sunshine first thing will be across southeastern parts of the UK. Further north and west, it's quite cloudy. There'll be some showery rain, and this slowly pushes south and eastwards through the day. Showers turning heavy at times by the afternoon. The odd rumble of thunder is possible, particularly across Northern England, Northern Ireland and Scotland too. We could see some localised disruption. And temperatures on the cool side, 17 to 19 across the north of the UK, 20 to 23, perhaps 24 across the far southeast of England. Into Thursday, a bright start to the morning. There will be some sunny spells around too, but there's scattered showers for many, perhaps less frequent and less heavy compared to recent days. Still highs around 23 or 24.
The temperature's rising. Boxed Solar, proud sponsors of weather on GBNews.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Mark, love the show, but you really ought to tie your tie with a Windsor knot. More symmetrical, more stately, more you. Well, Mark, you better come and tell me how to tie a Windsor knot, 'cause I think I know. Gary, we all wish we didn't have to use them, but needs must. The Ukrainians are defending their land against a merciless invasion of the country. And Bridget, I was a child during World War II. Cluster bombs are evil. Finland's former Minister of the Interior, that's equivalent to Home Secretary, has been embroiled in a battle for free speech after facing a criminal trial for quoting the Bible on Twitter. In 2019, Paivi Rasanen asked her Twitter followers where in the Bible there was justification for sponsoring the Helsinki Pride Parade. The text was accompanied by a picture of the following Bible verse. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness and the lusts of their hearts to dishonour their bodies among themselves, who exchanged truth of God for the lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Paivi was subsequently charged under a section of the Finnish Criminal Code entitled War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, which carries a maximum sentence of 2 years in prison. A plethora of hard-to-believe moments have emerged throughout the trial, from a clergyman who published a pamphlet written by Paivi, also facing criminal charges, to the state prosecutor likening the Bible to Mein Kampf. Despite being acquitted, Paivi is now going back to trial in August. Double jeopardy is not part of the constitutional settlement in Finland. We are witnessing a global trend of censoring individuals whose beliefs differ to those of the state, and the threat is far closer to the UK than we might like to believe. Well, I'm very pleased now to be joined by Paivi Rasanen and the barrister Lorcan Price from the Alliance Defending Freedom UK. Paivi, thank you so much for coming on. I thought Finland was a liberal country that believed in freedom of speech. So how could you be charged under war crimes legislation?
I have to say that this has been a big surprise also for me. I have been 28 years in public life in Parliament, but what has happened now during 4 years, it has been absurd. I have been twice in Helsinki District Court. I have been in police station interrogated about biblical issues, what Bible tells about humanity and sexuality. In Finland, we have the constitution, we have in principle, we have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We have also long roots in Christianity in Finland, and this happened in our country. So I think that it could happen anywhere.
And when you quoted those lines from the Bible, you were objecting to the church in Finland celebrating Pride because you thought that the church had no biblical right to do that. Did you get any pushback from the church in Finland? Did they mind that you were quoting the Bible?
In fact, it was the leadership of our church who supported this Pride event, and it was a shock to me. So, of course, they didn't give support to my Twitter posting. So the Archbishop has said that they think that it is okay that this case is investigated in court.
And so then there was a complaint made and you were arrested and you were interrogated for how long?
Altogether about 13 hours, three times.
And they were asking you about Christian teaching on sexuality?
Yes, it was an absurd situation. I was sitting in the police station. I had the Bible on the table, and the police was asking me that what is the message of the letter to Romans? What is about its first chapter? What do you mean by the concept of sin? and so on. It was about theological issues.
And the idea was that this was a hate crime under Finnish law.
Yes. I have never said anything which is hatred against any minority. I have I have said also in pamphlet, which is also investigated, that all people are equal. All are created as an image of God, and all people have dignity. But we are also all sinners, and it is God who says what is sin and what is not. And I have only said that it is against God's will to have sexual relationships outside the marriage, that the homosexual relationships are sin in front of God. And this was my so-called crime. And the prosecutor in court, she said that if you speak about sin, then you keep this person inferior to other people. But what I have said, it is about classical Christianity. So I think that it is dangerous for the freedom of Christianity.
When you were the equivalent of Home Secretary, you were obviously in charge of the police and security within Finland. Would you have thought that this was the law at the time? Did you think, when you put the tweet out, that you could be breaking the law and do it anyway?
No, I couldn't think. And in fact, the other charge is about the pamphlet that I had written on already 2004. I never thought that I'm breaking a law or that it is hate speech. It was a total surprise for me. And of course, I think that still that I have not committed any crime.
And you're being prosecuted again, which comes as a great surprise for an English audience.
Yes, even though that the police said that they didn't find any crime that before the first court session, and then I got the clear acquittal.
Look, Lorcan, I want to come to you because people can't break the law even if they don't like it. So the question is, do you think the law says this and that the law is wrong and therefore ought to be changed, or that the law is being wrongly applied?
Well, to the extent that the law would criminalise that type of behaviour, then I think the law is both being wrongly applied, but if it in fact does encompass this, and as Paivi has already said, 3 judges of the district court have found that it does not, then I think that would be an absurd proposition, and it would be contrary to Finland's obligations under international law, which require both at the European Convention level and at the United Nations Convention on Civil and Political Rights that freedom of religion is defended and protected, and free speech is protected.
But there are in the Bible some things, and my constituents have occasionally written to me quoting them, that are very unpleasant, that you wouldn't actually want to quote. So is the fact that it's in the Bible always a defence?
I think what we're talking about in the context of what Paivi was doing was communicating her beliefs publicly, both in the pamphlet that, as she mentioned, she wrote nearly 20 years ago now, and in a tweet directed at the leadership of her church. What the prosecution has claimed is that, as you saw, or as you introduced, that sometimes the Bible, and indeed they said the Quran and Mein Kampf, including all of these documents in the same context, generate hate and animosity towards minorities. But the difficulty with that is, and with all hate speech laws ultimately, is that you're criminalising somebody like Paivi for expressing something on the understanding that it creates an emotional response in a third person, not at all necessarily the audience for that communication. So
So what you're saying is hate speech has to be objectively generating hate rather than somebody dislikes it?
Well, that's the difficulty with it. And in the case of this prosecution...
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry to cut off that discussion, but thank you very much to Paivi and to Lorcan. Coming up, it's the commercial success. It's Sit Down with Sitwell. As pressure builds on the BBC, should we resist trial by media?
The 12th, a day to celebrate history, community and family here in Northern Ireland. Join me, Arlene Foster.
And me, Dougie Beattie, as we bring you live coverage of the July 12th celebrations from the beautiful city of Belfast.
And right across the United Kingdom. It's all happening here on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Pat says, I think we're on a slippery slope when it comes to limiting free speech. Public, MPs and the media should be fighting this before it's too late. Well, hear to Pat. Last night, amidst what seemed to be an ever-changing story, we affirmed the fundamental importance of the presumption of innocence. As the day began yesterday, the allegations against the unnamed BBC presenter seemed to reach breaking point. But next we heard that the individual in question, the alleged victim, was denying the allegations of inappropriate behaviour by his lawyer. Then the Sun claims to be standing by the parents of the individual and published quotes stating, "It is sad, but we stand by our account and we hope they get the help they need. We did this to help, and the presenter has got into their head," there being the individual who would otherwise be called the victim. But then today, when things seem to be entering into no man's land, fresh allegations of misconduct emerged against the very same presenter from yet another young person, including being pressured to meet as well as sending abusive messages. It's worth noting that The Sun is yet to publish the evidence that it says it has. So it's an unusually difficult topic for the commercial success that is sit down with Sitwell. But William, you yourself were once a victim of trial by media, and you found that there was a Twitter storm. I think I was one of the very few people to defend you, which probably didn't do you much good.
Certainly didn't, but thank you.
Trial by media is a pretty unpleasant aspect of modern social media, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I thought we lived in a fairly libertarian society these days where you can specify your gender, your sexual proclivities are up to you. And I think that I found the Philip Schofield affair incredibly uncomfortable because as far as I know, and I still haven't seen anyone accuse him of an actual crime. And just because you might not approve of someone's behaviour, it doesn't mean that their reputation has to be completely trashed. And this individual at the BBC seems to be on the same vein as this. And you get Twitter behaving appallingly. I think it's really interesting that people like Jeremy Vine and Nikki Campbell and Rylan are calling out the people who have tried to name them. And the vitriol that they get is appalling. Twitter, Instagram, if you ever suffered from abuse on those platforms, and I have, you try and complain about it. It goes absolutely nowhere. They either don't care about it, or they simply can't control the beast. And so what happens is people's reputation gets completely destroyed before they're able to stand up and defend themselves. And what often happens is when we see the truth of the story, when it starts to unravel, we actually realise that the supposition of criminal behaviour or the attitudes that people have about these people ends up being wrong because the truth is in a very different place.
The Twitter users, they have to be careful because if they put things on that aren't true, and Jeremy Vine has threatened to sue, the people accused who aren't the person involved can sue. And this happened to Sally Bercow. She lost a libel action and had to pay significant amounts of money in settlement. So it can be very expensive to tweet something when you don't know the facts.
Yes, and these people are incredibly naive. You know, just because you're sort of sitting in your sweaty flat abusing celebrities and you think you can get away with it. You know, in the old days, we sat at the television and shouted at it, and it didn't go further than our sitting rooms.
Fortunately, GBNews viewers are far too civilised to do any of these things and are well behaved. But I think you've touched on a very interesting thing, that the fact we don't know the name has actually made the story bigger and bigger and bigger. And I do sometimes wonder, if we weren't applying these invented privacy laws and The Sun had published the name last week, it would have given the person involved the chance to respond. Other newspapers would have been much more careful of piling in because of the libel laws. The Sun would have had to have taken on the risk of a libel action if it were wrong. It gives somebody accused a much better chance than a Twitter furore about something that people just don't know the facts about.
Yes, it strikes me that, you know, The Sun is behaving in the way that it did in the 80s, as a red top, trying to drag people down and expose people in a way that I think is rather old-fashioned, to put it mildly. And I think, obviously, as you suggest, the mystery that surrounds this person is what's made it so exciting. The guessing game is what's made it such, a dramatic story to follow.
Well, the Prime Minister on a visit to NATO is asked if he knows who the person is and says he doesn't. That if it gets to that level, it's clearly something that everybody is talking about. But I'm also interested in the point you make, that it may turn out that nothing illegal has happened, and it's very unclear from the current stories whether anything illegal has or hasn't happened. But is it right to say that public figures can do anything as long as it's legal? Or are viewers, listeners, readers of newspapers entitled to say, well, he may be allowed to do that, but actually I think that's pretty disagreeable?
I think it depends on whether you signed up to a particular code of conduct. I think that if an MP stands on a ticket of being a family man, and that classic shot of the Member of Parliament standing by the garden gate with his faithful wife and children, and it's then revealed that he has numerous mistresses and different families, I think it's absolutely right. I also think that if you choose to go into public life, and I know this is a view that you have, that you need to take the flak that goes with that. And I think that if you are a key national broadcaster, then perhaps there's a certain decorum. But the problem is, it's got to be written in stone, because there are too many grey areas here. Who's to say that one individual can join, dating apps and do what they want to do?
Isn't the nation entitled to come to a view, and isn't it to some extent about power? And that the issue the BBC has in handling this with the Jimmy Savile affair is that people with great power as national figures abused it with the BBC behind them and covering up. And that's what makes it a story of national interest, even if no crime has been committed.
I mean, reading between the lines of this individual, I don't sense a huge abuse of power. The latest revelations I've read carefully are about some activity on a dating app. Dating apps are there for people to meet. The characters said that they don't want to meet this individual. That character's then said, right, well, I shall go to the press and say, and announce your name, and that person's then got cross about it. So I really don't see that develops the story in a particular way.
Well, it may not surprise you to know that I've never used a dating app in my life. I wouldn't know where to find one. But thank you, William. I understand you've got a bicycle ride to get your dinner, so I hope you cycle safely through the streets of London. That's all from me. Up next, it's Professor Mark Dolan in for Professor Dan Wootton. Mark, would you be talking by the BBC by any chance this evening?
It's the only story in town. Jacob, a huge crisis for our national broadcaster, with a new story developing published in tonight's Sun website that this alleged presenter, who we're told paid for these particular images from a young person, may have broken COVID lockdown rules and had an encounter with one such person. So it's a BBC in Crisis special with stories breaking as we speak.
OK. Mind you, I think that we should now get away from COVID rules. Surely they've gone. But that's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow from 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and there's going to be the sun shining in Somerset tomorrow beautifully.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GBNews.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. Further heavy showers over the next few days, quite breezy as well, temperatures around average for the time of year. So we look at the bigger picture. Low pressure is in charge of our weather at the moment, bringing in those showers. Pushes just a little further east over the next few days, introducing a northwesterly flow. So quite chilly around some northwestern coasts of the UK. To end Tuesday, showers fade for a time across parts of England and Wales, but continue across Northern Ireland and Scotland. Through the night, some of these heavy at times, then pushing back into Northern England and North Wales by the end of the night. Temperatures for all in double figures, 14 or 15 Celsius as minimums in towns and cities, a little lower in the countryside. The best of the sunshine first thing will be across southeastern parts of the UK. Further north and west, it's quite cloudy. There'll be some showery rain, and this slowly pushes south and eastwards through the day. Showers turning heavy at times by the afternoon. The odd rumble of thunder is possible, particularly across Northern England, Northern Ireland and Scotland too. We could see some localised disruption, and temperatures on the cool side, 17 to 19 across the north of the UK, 20 to 23, perhaps 24 across the far southeast of England. Into Thursday, a bright start to the morning. There will be some sunny spells around too, but there's scattered showers for many, perhaps less frequent and less heavy compared to recent days. Still highs around 23 or 24.
That warm feeling inside. from boxed boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.